Green?
Yeah, it's recording now.
Great. And yes, we are recording this event for later. So to those of you who asked, we will be recording it and putting it up on both of our channels going forward. But yes, thank you for joining this special crossover event. This is UX Research and Strategy and Service Design Network Dallas chapter. We are old friends in the Dallas community and now going global with our events due to COVID, who have pushed us online, which has been awesome. I see there are a little over 500 of you on now. And so thank you very much for joining us today, wherever you're joining from. We're going to try to get straight to the main event as fast as we can, but we do have a couple announcements before we get started. So I'm going to try to zoom through those so we can get to Erica sharing her knowledge with us. Did want to promote our social media channels. Please do follow us. We both groups, we put out a bunch of content and got regular events going on. So if this is your first event, definitely make sure you're following us to see what is coming up. We do have, since this is a lunch event today for those in the central time zone, we did cut our normal networking if you've joined us before, but we are doing a special networking extravaganza on April 19th, which is just networking. We did one of these a few months ago and it was really well received. And so please join us and meet new UX friends, expand your network, and just get a chance to talk with others around the world. You can get tickets for that on Eventbrite, and we are limiting this to just a couple hundred folks due to breakout room capacity. Our next monthly meetup is for UX Research and Strategy is on May 12th at 5 p.m. And that's when strategy meets public service. And we've got 3 awesome ladies from the San Francisco government to chat with us and share their knowledge with us. So that this is one you don't want to miss. So check out Eventbrite for that. And I think Jen is putting some links in the chat. And then Greg, you want to talk about your next service design network event?
Sure. Our next event will be on May the 18th. We try to have a bit of a balance of very high level service design topics, and we try to go a bit deeper on some other topics that could be of interest of the designers all over the world. This time we'll have the wonderful Trip Odell, who's the director of product design from Pearson, and we'll be discussing neurodiversity, accessibility, and inclusive design, which are all different things that have a tendency to get lumped up. Sometimes people don't really understand the difference between inclusive design, accessibility, and neurodiversity. So we'll go a bit deeper onto what it means to us designers to be able to design with those different lenses as we try to cater to everyone to create the best possible experiences for everyone.
Great. So just a couple house rules. There are almost 750 of you. So please mute yourself if you haven't already. If you come off mute, we might mute you. And so definitely use the chat to ask your questions. Since there are a lot of people, if chat really distracts you from listening, definitely open it and put it to the side. If you're on the desktop, you can do that. That's a helpful trick that someone shared last time. Ask your questions in the chat. And please don't add your LinkedIn links to the chat because it really causes a big traffic jam when we're trying to look for the awesome questions that you have for Erica. So please follow those rules so we can be respectful of everyone. This event will be recorded. If you do not want your face or your name in the recording, you can turn off your camera or change your name to a generic name or something like that. And then just follow our code of conduct and treat everyone with respect, be kind and empathetic, no negative or offensive comments, and definitely no microaggressions. We want to be a safe space here for everybody to chat about UX topics and not have to worry about inclusivity or things related to that. So please just be respectful. All right. And without further ado, Greg, would you like to introduce our wonderful host, Erica Hall?
Sure. So today we'll have the privilege to have Erica Hall to discuss with us UX research and how important it is. Everything we do starts with research. So we want to have the authority to answer the questions we have, us as a group, and also yours in the chat room. Usually the questions are pretty sharp and pretty, there's a very, very keen audience we have. So I expect the questions to be very, very pointed. We're looking forward to have Erika's answers on some of the questions we struggle with every day in our daily lives as designers and service designers and UX researchers. Research is a very fungible domain that can go very deep and very broad. So we're looking forward to have Erika guide us through our everyday struggle with research and what can be done, what cannot be done, what can be achieved, when can be challenged. So we're going to ask her some questions and see if she has all the answers for us.
Awesome. Erika, anything you want to add to that before we get right into it?
No, that sounds fantastic. Yeah, I will do my best to be helpful.
So just to make sure, if you are on this call, you most likely have this book at home, if not one, maybe two, maybe three. It's a must-have. So if you don't have it, get it. It's a wonderful book. It is easy to read, easy to keep, easy to go back to. It's basically everything you need to know, so you actually can do have very impactful research for your job. You can put the link on the Amazon if you want.
Mm-hmm. What I will say is you can't get it on Amazon. You have to get it direct from a book apart.
Okay, so we'll get the link to that.
Yeah, and I apologize if you're not in America. Shipping is expensive. We're working on international distribution. I'm trying to work with the publisher on that because I know so many people I talk to are outside the US, and then they ask me why is shipping $25? Yeah, so.
Is this new, Erika? Because I swear I get mine on Amazon, but I could be wrong. But is this new?
Some books find their way to Amazon,
okay.
But it's never been like an official channel, and I'm not sure if they have the second edition. Maybe they do. Maybe they do.
All right. Lauren, you want to start us up?
Absolutely. So let me get to the next one. Go right ahead.
Oh, so yeah, so I would just start because it's just two different groups. We have a lot of like UX research and service design research. So Erika, the very first high-level question is like, we are all using the same tools and methodology to do some research, quant, stakeholders, interviews, stuff like that. In your mind, what is the biggest difference for a service designer approaching a research plan versus a UX designer approaching research as well?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. And what I'd say is the way I think about research, there's no significant difference because it all starts with the same process. You have to be clear on your goals, which is the number one most important step, and something that I think a lot of teams and organizations kind of skip through. They skip to the methodology. They say, oh, we're going to talk to users or customers. We're going to create a journey map. And they don't take the step to stop and pause and say, what are our goals? Like generally business goals, organization goals. How do we know if we're successful? And get really clear about that. And then once you're really clear about what success looks like to you, how you want to change the world for the better, then you say, okay, what do we need to know to do that? Where are the gaps in our knowledge? Where are our assumptions? And that's exactly the same, no matter if you're doing, UX design, service design, marketing, starting a business, planning a vacation. It's all the same process. And I think what happens is people get into fights about methodologies because they haven't done the work up front to get that shared clarity. And that's where you get the what method's better, what documentation's better. It all depends on what are you trying to accomplish. And then once you have that clarity, and once you know where the gaps in your information are and what you need to know in order to make the decisions to be successful, then you choose your approach and your plan based on what you need to know. And that's the same for any sort of applied research, I think.
Very good. Lauren, do you want to start the first question or the second question?
Absolutely. So for researchers and designers, it's often hard to get buy-in for the time and budget, or the perception of time and budget to do research. And love to know, what have you found to be the most effective way to get that buy-in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really glad that you use the word perception there, because the first thing is to recognize that all of the objections that are based on schedule and budget are a complete fabrication. They're a total smokescreen, because there's time and money, right? There is plenty of time and money. If there is time and money to do whatever the project is at hand, if there's time and money to run a business, then there's time and money to become informed. And I think those objections are raised because it's an easy way for somebody with power or influence in an organization to avoid doing research, because they have a thing they want to do and they don't want pesky reality to interfere with the thing they want to do. So once you recognize that, oh, the time and budget is just an objection that's being thrown up, if you go back to your questions, because a lot of times there's an idea that research needs to take a certain amount of time or amount of money to be done well. And that's not true, because if you know what you need to know and you know what you're going to do with the information, you can answer your questions in a process that can take varying amounts of time. And the general rule is that the bigger the decision, the more time or budget that you're going to be investing in whatever course of action that you're trying to inform. That tells you, how much time you should be spending making sure that you're confident. And it also depends on like what you know and what you don't know. That's why that first part of the process I talked about is so important, because you might get everybody together around a table and say, what do we actually need to know? And you might find out that you know a lot already, or you might find out that you have some pretty big assumptions that are just like made up wishful thinking. And you won't even know how much time or budget learning is going to take until you do that.
Yeah. So follow-up question is, what do you suggest teams do when they're told they can't or shouldn't do research?
Redefine research to be something that has been permitted explicitly.
Any tips for how to do that, to reframe that?
Well, the most important research that you need to do is internal, right? You need to understand how the decision makers, the people who are controlling that aspect of your reality, you need to understand them. Because if you understand those people well, then you can explain to them how your work makes them more successful. Because I think one thing to let go of is, don't convince anybody to value research. Who cares? Who cares what you call it, right? You want to make better, more informed decisions. You want to increase the chance of success. You want to decrease risk. So talk in those terms, because research to a lot of people sounds like wasted time, wasted money, time not doing work, which means not manufacturing visible artifacts. So you don't need to get somebody to care about research. You just need to find a way to do the things you need to do to make whatever you're doing successful.
I love that. Do research on your stakeholders to understand what makes them tick, and then reframe your needs in that way. That's great advice.
Yeah. And that's something that a lot of teams just don't do. And I have a whole line of consulting business, which is like, people come to me and they're like, how do we get stakeholders to buy into research? And it's like, well, do you know what their basis of decision making is? Do you have an explicit framework for decision making in your organization? And they're like, no, because there's this idea that there's a right way to do things that involves a certain set of like artifacts or methods, and that gets really dogmatic. And the worst thing is a dogmatic researcher, right? Who's like, oh, we only do things in this one way, as opposed to always asking the question, what do we need to know and what's the best way to find out? Because sometimes you can learn what you need to learn in an hour. There's so much. If you have a good question, you can go out on the internet and do what we all do in daily lives. Like, this is the thing that's so wild to me, is that we, just to live life, right? Just to live life in the 21st century, we are constantly researching. Like, Google, like Alphabet, is worth a tremendous amount of money because people are always forming queries and doing research, but we don't call it that. You know, you would never, like, you wouldn't order dinner, you wouldn't order takeout without doing research, right? But you don't think about it because it's just natural. It's like, oh, would you just like put your hand like in a door and they hand you a bag and that's your dinner? You'd say, no, I want to read reviews, I want to talk to people, I'm investing $50 in takeout. But we're doing $1 million project and it's like, oh, we have to do research. That's ridiculous.
I love that analogy. I'm going to use that with my partners next time they say we can't do research, and like, you research everything. That's great.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. But all of a sudden you're like, because the thing people don't want to admit is that what they really want to do is be proven right in work. And they want to have the authority. They want to have the truth. They want to have the answers. They want to have that special, you call it intuition, right? That's the word you hear all the time. Oh, I have my intuition. Intuition is a combination of experience, which is a form of research, right? You've experienced these things, you've seen these things, and confirmation bias, right? You want certain things to be true and you're bummed when they aren't true. You're bummed if you wanted to build a feature or you wanted to design something a certain way and you talk to the customers and you find out they want something super boring. Like, this is a thing we don't talk about enough in, like, I think in service design more, but not as much in UX design. A lot of what really meets people's needs, like really truly, is super like boring to design. Like, I don't think it's boring because I think it's really cool to do things that make life easier for people. But a lot of times the best design is, what if we had writers? Like, if organizations hired way more writers than engineers or visual designers, I think they could actually improve their software like tremendously. But that sounds boring. That's not technology. That's like writing is a 6,000-year-old technology or something like that. That doesn't count as design, right? And so people want to do like the new cool thing. Oh, I want to have like a lamp that talks to me. Cool. That's not what people want, right? And that's I think at the heart of all these objections to research, is if you really set aside your biases and you really ask questions like, what do we need? The people doing the work don't want to hear those answers.
Yeah, so true. Great insight there, Erica. I'll switch to the next meaty question here. Go ahead, Greg.
So, Erica, we've all been part of projects where either there is, as we discussed, there is no research, no value for research, a little bit of research, or sometimes too much research, right? Then we have this synthesis paralysis, if you will. So I want to know from you, when is it enough? When do you actually reach critical mass of research? When do we have enough research to turn into insights that can be turned into ideation, prototyping, something to build, to convince people to get extra funding? There's a lot of people at play here, right? So, and everybody has, as you just mentioned, some people get kind of like antsy. It's kind of like, nothing has been happening for the past 6 weeks. I want to see something, right? So there is a need for business to see stuff. So when do you know you have enough to start building stuff? What is the threshold?
Mm-hmm. There are a couple of answers to that. One is just reset the whole organization's expectations that you're ever done researching. Because if you went to like a software company and you said, okay, when are you done coding? When can the engineers just stop? The answer would be never, because you're continuously improving. So I'd really like organizations to reframe research as continuous learning, right? If you're making stuff, if you're producing or delivering, if you're making decisions, learning accompanies that at every stage. It's the same thing. It's like, we're always learning, because you don't want to stop learning, because the second you stop learning, that's when you get all the risk, right? When you're not like looking at the world. So you should have the mindset that like, of course, we're always going to be learning. And if you take the word research out of it, right, just ditch that word. And you say, okay, what do we need to know to make this decision? There's a fantastic quote that I pull out all the time because it's from the Wall Street Journal, which is very comforting to business people. It's from an article called The Power of Thick Data. And the quote is, all business is placing bets on human behavior. So a good way to figure out enough is to ask the question, how big of a bet are we placing? And if you're placing a really big bet, you should probably be better informed. But that information can come from a lot of places. Maybe you don't need to do as much formal research if you're working with a team with like a tremendous amount of experience solving this problem, who genuinely has worked with this audience before. Or if you're doing something and you have big questions and you get together and you ask these big questions, you need to do more work to find the answer. But again, that kind of work depends on what you actually need to know and whether somebody else hasn't asked the question already. So what I really recommend teams do is everybody wants to brainstorm ideas. I think brainstorming ideas is hot garbage, because what that does is it puts people in competition with each other to prove that they're right or prove that they're smarter, which is already anti-collaborative. You get your team together and you brainstorm questions. This is what I want everybody to start doing. You get in a room, virtually otherwise, and you say, okay, where are our greatest unknowns? And you just get them all out there. And then you rank them by what's the actual thing that we just don't know? And what are the highest priority questions? Like, what's the biggest question that we have the least information about? And if our assumptions are wrong, that's going to tank us. And that's the one you answer. And you also have to get away, like, in addition to never being done with research, you have to let go of being certain, because a lot of times that's the question behind it, is like, okay, when are we going to be certain that we know everything? And you're not. You're going to be confident. It's exactly like what I was talking about ordering dinner or planning a vacation. There's a point where you have sufficient confidence where you're like, okay, everybody in my flat has agreed we want Thai food. We're really hungry, so it's more important that we get the food fast than we get the very best Thai restaurant in the city. There, boom. You've identified your needs. You look on the delivery website and you say, oh, this Thai place is the one that has 4 stars and delivers in 30 minutes. There, you have enough confidence to make that decision. But if you're, say, picking a caterer for your wedding, which is like the highest stakes kind of like food specification I could think of, you're not just going to sit down and say, okay, who can feed 50 people on Tuesday? That's not how that decision gets made. So you do more research. You look at the caterers, you read reviews, you go out for tastings. It's exactly the same in an organization. But everybody's brains are broken because they're so afraid of all the other people they work with. It's not hard. The thing that's hard is getting that collaborative environment in place so people don't feel like if they need a little extra time, or if they admit they don't know something, which is, it's like step 0 for learning, is admitting you don't know. If you're not in a safe environment, then you're constantly, all your brain power is worried about not looking stupid in front of your colleagues. Once you get rid of that and you have a collaborative environment where people are clear on the goals, then it's cool. You're supporting each other and you're not freaked out that you have to prove that you know more than somebody else.
So do you have a tip or trick? Because confidence is very subjective, obviously. If you have 5 people in the same room, there's different, 5 different opinions, 5 different confidence. So do you have a tip to get alignment on confidence? And also, is there such a time in space that you can actually have too much research? We actually have too much confidence. When do you know you've actually crossed that threshold? You can like, okay, now we know too much. We need to pare it down because we actually answered 6 questions instead of 2.
Well, I don't think you can ever like know too much. I guess the way to think about that is if you're not focused, right? And the most important thing is just being clear on your goal. And it's all conversations. Like so much of the important work is just talking to people. And that's very scary for people because everybody wants an artifact that they can point to, or they want like, oh, look at all the code, look at all the stuff we've made. Look at the diagram I've made. And so much of this is like, if you get together with other people and you're like, okay, so we're going to make this decision. We've agreed this is the goal. This is our recommended course of action. We're basing it on this that we've learned. Here are some remaining questions. How does everybody feel? You know, does anybody have any like objections? Does anybody, can anybody find any weaknesses in our course of action? And if you have an open, candid discussion like that, it can be really fast. But one of the other problems with asking questions is people are really afraid of questioning a course of action. And that's why things happen that are bad, is because you need a room of people that genuinely support each other, that genuinely see shared success. And when you have that, then somebody can raise their hand and say, oh, what about this? This seems like it might be a risk. And then the other people will consider that and say, oh gosh, I think you're right. How do we reduce that risk? And you go from there. There's no magic answer. It's critical thinking. And it's getting to a place not of like consensus really, because consensus is like, oh, we're all agreeing and nobody's arguing. Collaboration is where you have clear standards of evidence and clear goals, and you can argue, but you know that at a point like, okay, we have to make a decision. We've worked with a lot of clients in media and journalism. Journalists are the best clients because they know how to do this, right? If you've ever seen a front page meeting for a paper, for the papers that still print and have front pages, they spend an hour, and all the editors for all the different departments will, first they'll review the previous day's front page, which is a representation of what that organization thinks is the most important going on in the world. And they'll say, it'll be like a retrospective, the shortest retrospective. How do we feel about yesterday's decisions? Were we right about our prioritization? Could we have done something differently? Okay, great, moving on. They have 1 hour to decide what's on the next day's front page. And everybody makes their case and they argue, and maybe they say, oh, you know, the story about politics is huge. This should be like this big. And somebody else says, well, something else has happened, like say it's the pandemic and we have a COVID discovery and we feel that's really important. And because they have a clear shared set of goals as well as principles, and they all feel like we want tomorrow's front page to represent our best collective judgment, because they share that, they can fight. And then, you know, then they say, okay, the hour is up. We have to decide, like, tomorrow's headline is going to be about this. It's going to be this big, like this many column inches for this story. Boom, boom, boom. They ship it. And that's every day the paper comes out. And it's exactly the same process in every other kind of organization, or it should be. You have a deadline, right? You know what your deadline is. You know what your goal is. If you know what your standards are, if you know what quality is to you, and if you know what the relative priorities are, you can make those decisions. And you know what? Sometimes you're going to be wrong, but your goal is always to like manage the risk. That's just what it is to do business.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much, Erica. Lauren?
Yeah, I have one follow-up question, then I'll get to the next one. But something that comes up a lot when designers, researchers are dealing with business analysts or people that are very data centric, and how do you manage the reducing uncertainty to make a decision against the I guess, non-statistically significant qualitative data? Like, how do you overcome that?
Well, step one is, of course, you have to get that collaborative environment. You have to like get to know each other, like interview those people, whatever the process is, so everybody feels that shared success. That has to happen first. Then once you have that, the way to think about qualitative and quantitative data is you need both. But you have to figure out in advance, going back to the goal and the question, the things everybody want to like speed right by. If you have a qualitative question, you can't answer that with numbers, right? If your question is, how do people decide what to have for dinner during COVID times? Like if that's your question, because you're trying to help out with that, you can't math your way to an answer. What you can do is like learn about what people are doing through a variety of different methods. You're like, oh, we think people are doing this. Okay, well then what's our quantitative question? Do we need to know like how much money people are spending? Do we need to know like what portion of Americans are using, DoorDash versus going to the grocery store, right? Too many people, because there's this bias that quantitative information is somehow better than qualitative, because again, everybody's afraid of looking stupid in front of their colleagues, and they're like, here's a number. Numbers are false certainty, right? A number is just a measurement. If you go in the real world, again, outside business where people get all wacky, we know this. Like if somebody was like planning a vacation and asked their friend and they were like, how was the place that you stayed? Tell me about it. And the person replied like, $300 a night. Like, what do you do with that? Do you know, like, is it good for kids? Is it romantic? Because you have descriptive qualitative questions. And you always get in this thing about like, prove to me the value of qualitative data. And you just have to reject that, right? Because that's a garbage framing. What you have to do is go back and say, what do we need to know? What do we actually need to know? And what will it take for us to be confident? But the most important thing is to have that collaborative basis. So okay, we need to know what's going on in the world before we can measure it, right? Qualitative knowledge has to go first, or you're going to be using the wrong instrument to measure things, right? Yeah. You're going to be like using a ruler to check the temperature, which is a lot of what people do. Or you're going to be using garbage survey data and you're like, well, it's numbers, so it's more important. Numbers don't have any context.
Erika, I have a follow-up to the follow-up question before we move on next question. I have a very practical example. We had Mark Stickdorn on the show last year, and he mentioned a very, very large German telecom company who had a very thorough, very disciplined approach to what they were looking for, right? They had questions and they went to market, did the research, and they were very disciplined about it. They get to a place and they realized they had so much data to analyze that it was too much. They would literally go back to business like, no, it's going to take us probably 1.5 or 2 years to go through all that stuff, to go back to you with some recommendations, so on and so forth. So they were doing such a great job at research, so to speak, that they get to a place where there was too much research. And then they were like, what are we supposed to be doing now? Because business wanted results. And they were told, we can't give you results for like another year, which was unacceptable. So what would you have done and what would you recommend in that example?
Yeah. That's a great example. What I call that situation is a lot of data and no understanding, right? They weren't good at research because you can't be good at research unless you know what your question is. All they did was they went out and hoovered up data. Data doesn't have any value. Having more doesn't mean you did anything better. And that's a huge misconception and a huge assumption, because it goes back to people's own insecurity in how organizations set up these toxic environments for decision making. If you have a good question, your goal should be to answer that question as quickly and confidently as possible. But you have to reframe the whole thing, because all they've done is create more work for themselves, right? They didn't solve their business problem. They optimized for like gathering a lot of data without knowing why. You have to know what you need to know beforehand, or else you're just going to create this huge problem for yourself. Like I've actually gone and I've worked with clients, and this is super fun. It's a super fun kind of work for me. I went in and I was working with an organization, much smaller organization in that situation. I said, okay, we've got like 30 marketing analytics consultants, like no joke. We have all this data. We've been fighting for a year with our agency of record about the direction we should take our this design project. And we keep fighting, but we have all this data and we don't know what to do. And they had all these numbers and they were fighting about what the numbers meant. And no joke, we went in there and within 3 weeks of getting everybody in a room, figuring out what decisions they wanted to make, figuring out what they needed to know, doing like, it was even like the first like half dozen interviews we did, all of a sudden they realized how wrong they'd been and that they'd just been asking the wrong questions. And we fixed their situation. It takes me 6 weeks to go into an organization and fix exactly the problem you described. And I would say any organization, it takes 6 weeks. Because what it takes is like 1 week of how did you get in this screwed up situation? 1 week of interviewing all the stakeholders so I understand what their pathologies are. Then it's like 1 week of figuring out what you need to know now, given what you've learned, the situation you're in and your goals. And then like 2 weeks of usually some qualitative work to fill in the gaps. And then I'm like, go with God, and their shit's fixed. And it doesn't take that long. But it takes not being afraid of anybody in the organization. Like, I'm not smarter than any of my clients. I'm just not afraid of the same people they're afraid of. I don't care. Like, I don't care about getting fired. I don't care about them thinking I'm smart. Like, everybody's so concerned with looking smart that it makes them stupid.
Interesting.
Yeah?
All right. That's perfect answer right there. Can we just stop the meeting now, Lauren?
I'm very efficient.
Very, sounds like it. And you don't care.
I'm so efficient.
All right, Lauren, you want to get the next question?
Yeah.
Are you frozen? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Did I freeze up a second?
Yeah.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. What methods do you like to use when you're really tight on time, budget, or other resources?
It's the same one. Get everybody in a room and figure out what you don't know, which takes an hour. Do that question prioritization, because that's the method everybody wants to skip past, is like, what do we actually need to know? Because the greater clarity you have about your question, and then like, when do we need to know it by? If your question is like, again, I'll use the same question, like, how do people figure out what to have for dinner? Okay, we've got a week. Great. It's like you start from what you need to know and how much time and money you have, and you can learn something. Like there's a lot of stuff on the internet, and like talking to people, once you know the right people to talk to, it takes like a very small amount of upfront conversations to save so much time. But then researchers fall in the same trap that I was talking about designers and business people falling in. Like they feel like, oh, I don't add value unless I go through a really formal process. But if the point is learning, what if you're able to learn something like super fast, right? And not using a fancy tool. You know, what if you can, like, I saw you're talking to Indy. Like, I love Indy. She's a good friend of mine. I never see her because she lives across the bridge in Marin. And so we've spent like 4 years talking about getting together, but we only talk on the phone. Indy talks to people on voice calls. That's her problem space research. And she can learn so much. You can learn so much if you talk to the right people and you know what you need to know. But that's the step you can't skip, right? But it feels so scary for people. Everybody wants to say like, oh, I mean, it's like what you were talking about, like people talk about jobs to be done. Who cares if jobs to be done works for you in your context? Awesome. If it's the wrong thing, but it's like what everybody's decided is the safe tool to use because nobody will yell at you for it, then that's bad. So you just have to get in a room and talk to each other and say, okay, what do we actually need to know? By when? How confident do we need to be? Yeah, it's terrifying because you can't hide behind a methodology or a document. And you have to admit you don't know something, which is the hardest part. But it's the question. Like, it all goes back to like figuring out a good question, which you can do fast if you're not trying to solve for all these other goals, which are not get fired, not get yelled at, have the quant people like not dismiss me. You know, if you really are honestly in a place where you're like, we want to learn something, you can learn things really fast, like really fast.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like, get back to basics and really focus yourself and get it all out there. And I noticed a question in the chat earlier when you were talking about that vulnerability and admit what you don't know. And how do you help people overcome that fear of feeling or looking stupid?
If you're a person in leadership, the most important thing you can do is model that for people. And admit that you don't know things, like confidently and enthusiastically, because it's an opportunity to learn. Anybody with any sort of standing in an organization should, as much as possible, like just do that. Just be like, I don't know. Try to catch yourself making up an answer, because this is something, once you start looking for it in yourself, like somebody asks you something and you realize you're speculating, that's a good practice. I'll tell you, like a long time ago, we were working with some folks from the Wall Street Journal who put on this conference, and I went to this conference, I guess it was 2007. And Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were both speaking at this conference. And there were all these other like business, it was a big deal business conference. There were a lot of heads of very large enterprises. And they would get on stage in these interviews. And when they heard these questions about the future of the market or business or whatever, they would speculate. And then Steve Jobs got on stage for his interview. And this was like the only time I saw him speak in person. And Walt Mossberg asked him to speculate on like the future of like, what do you think the future of like streaming media is? It was something like that, like related to the Apple TV or something. And Steve Jobs paused and he said, I don't know, but I'm really excited to find out. And seeing that, after seeing all these other people, like the head of Viacom, like blah, 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 numbers, projections, to see Steve Jobs like just admit, like, I don't know, why would I know that? Nobody knows that. But isn't it exciting that we're creating the future, right? As designers, as technologists, isn't that cool? Man, he made everybody else look like an idiot. And it's that, but everybody like rushes to speculate. Like we see this on the news, on cable news, if there's a disaster and there's no information, people speculate. So it's like, stop speculating, right? Stop rewarding that in your organization, on your team, and that's how you create the culture. It's like one conversation at a time. You just say, okay, how do we know that? What's the basis of information? So you can start to separate out, this is just something I hope is true versus I have evidence for that. And not in like, and don't like bust people in a hostile way, but just create that culture of always questioning, like, is this the right thing to do? Is this just an assumption? Is this really a pattern we're seeing in the data? Or is that just what I'm hoping we're seeing? Because that would be mildly convenient because we've already created this whole product or service along those assumptions. It's just one conversation at a time. Reorienting people around always asking questions, and making decisions and making your decision process really explicit. But it's building that practice and getting away from, oh, this is the right methodology, or, oh, this is the answer, and we're like defending our answer.
Yeah, love that. It's all about the culture and how it's modeled. Great. All right, moving on to the next question here, if I can get it to go. All righty. Greg, go ahead.
So Erica, what are some creative ways? You just told us a lot of them. So it's basically about collaboration and building confidence. So can we dig a bit deeper and give us some more like creative ways to share research findings so the insights actually are bubbling up internally and you actually can get traction internally so we can actually just move on?
So I'll say the process that's very common where researchers go out and get a lot of data and then try to make their case to some decision makers, that process is doomed. Because so much research gets done, like very good, a lot of data is collected, and then it just gets ignored. And so the biggest problem I want to solve is getting people to not ignore things. And the best way to do that is to involve those people, like whoever you want to act in a certain way, have that conversation in the beginning about what do we need to know. So if you get them invested in asking the question and participating in that process, which again is often a conversation you can do in an hour or 90 minutes, and it also depends on how much, there's like technical debt and design debt. I think there's also critical thinking debt, which is huge in a lot of organizations where it's like, we've never actually been honest about what we know with each other. And so now things are going to get ugly for a little while before they get better. But if you start and you say, okay, we want to learn this. We want to learn this for this reason because it fits in with this goal. What do we need to know? And you actually involve them up front in the prioritizing questions. Okay, what do you think is most important for us to learn about? What do we already know? Where are the gaps? If you get everybody who you want to use the information at the end of, whatever your research project is, involved at the very beginning, they're invested, right? They've got context, and then keep them involved along the way. Have them participate as much as possible, whether it's just like listening in, whether it's talking about recruiting, like make them participants. And there are ways to do this. If you design the process well with this in mind, there are ways to do this where people can kind of like touch in and out. And like everybody's got this obsession about research repositories, which I think is like hot garbage too. The world is your research repository. If you have a good question, you can dip in and out and not just go back to like, oh, what was that study that we got permission to do 2 years ago? That's like the only thing we can learn, right? But if you design your process to be participatory and conversational and have this understanding of like, oh, we're all just learning. We all have a shared understanding of what we need to know and what our goals are. I keep saying that over and over again because it's so rare and that makes everything easier. Yeah. So it's like the best way to share findings so the insights are internalized is that if everybody knows, it's not a surprise at the end. It's not like, new information. Everybody has this bad idea that research results in an aha with like new information. We already know like 99% of what we need to design things really well. The question is like, why do we still design things badly? And it's because people just want to make things they want to make without reference to reality. So it's kind of like retooling the process.
Yeah.
Because if you just give somebody a report, and they're not already bought in to the process, there's nothing you can put in that report that will make them care.
So Erica, we know business are very siloed. Already we find this every day. This is where we exist, to break the silos, right? But within the business, design is siloed, and within design, research is even more siloed, and sometimes kind of like different building, different city, a whole different place. So how do you recommend to actually get that engagement? How do you actually get the people engaged, involved in the process that may be in a different country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I had some researchers in a workshop I did once who said they were in a different building that had like a different air conditioning system. They had like more oxygenated air because they thought that, like researchers needed to breathe better or something. It's so weird. Yeah, that's a big problem. And I think the more that you turn the research, like if the researchers in an organization kind of make this their project, like that is the most important research project, is understanding the organizational context in which decisions are made and reprogramming people kind of one at a time. There's no shortcut for that. There's no magic shortcut, right? And the other thing is to retain your sanity, recognize that, to say, we can't change the whole organization at once. We're in this situation. We need more shared understanding. And so that's kind of like your research question is, how do we change our organization to like have better critical thinking and make better decisions, and then just make that a project? And it's going to be different in every organization. The most important thing is to sort of do an analysis to say, what are the incentives, right? Because people only do things because of habits and incentives. What are the incentives for not using research? And look at that, because I think that can be surprising and shocking once you turn that question inside. Because I bet, I met this group of consultants, and like one of the projects that they worked on was going into organizations and finding projects to kill, right? Because this is the fear. Like there was an executive, they got budget, they developed a line of business, all out of their head, and it's like chugging along. And if you really said, is this doing anything for us? If you really asked, does anybody need this? The answer would be no. But you don't want to take away somebody's power and budget, right? So they don't want research. They don't want anybody asking questions of their customers to find out like, oh, you're actually doing this totally useless thing that somebody else is doing better. So step one is understanding all of those incentives for continuing to work in ignorance. Who loses if you learn things about reality? That's a good question to ask in your organization.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I think we have one more hard question, so to speak. And Lauren, you can go ahead and ask the last question, and we can try to see if we can have some of the audience questions. Erica, are you okay going a bit long? Because we have a lot of questions. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, this is our last prepared question, and we'll take some from the audience. But what do you recommend to do when all the existing research was conducted by different people, maybe a previous research team, or there was a reorg or something, and you really don't have a lot of insight into the methods used, how the insights were formed, but you're encouraged to build from the past and not recreate the insights? What do you recommend there?
Don't like, if you're encouraged to use it, that means like, oh, we're not going to allow you to continue learning, right? I would say like unpack that, because just because you have existing research, and it's like existing research is like content. People treat it like it's useful. And we would get into this situation when we work with clients on design projects, and they'd say, oh, we had some people who did some research last year. We already learned that. And I'd say, well, that's great, but we have different questions, right? You have to shift the value from the answers to the questions, because answers have a really short shelf life, right? What you learned like a year ago could not at all map today's reality. But if you need fresh questions, and you ask your questions, and then you ask those questions again, and you could probably learn fresh things like real fast. There's always this idea, there's this sunk cost fallacy, like, oh, we paid this consultant $200,000, so what they did must be worth something. It's like, have the courage to call stuff garbage and useless when it's garbage and useless. But of course, understand your stakeholders enough so you know, like, oh, how do I frame what I'm saying in a way that makes them feel awesome, right?
Yeah. There was a similar question from the audience, from Simon, is how do you know when biased research is used with questionable methods, and how do you know when to spot that bias and see kind of when you can say, hey, this is garbage research. We actually need to do something different.
Yeah. Like if you see, I tend, like, it's like anything that was done in the past. It's like people get so weirdly attached to that. You know, if you weren't a part of it, assume it's garbage. You know, what if it is garbage? Go from there. Yeah. What do you need to know? It all goes back to, like, what do you actually need to know? Are you trying to save the results of something somebody did in the past? And this all comes because there's this idea that learning has to be expensive and time consuming. Like that you have to try to save something. But if you're reading through a report, it's like, it's the same way you look at anything in science, right? Like it's sort of like you're doing your peer review and you're like, okay, what was the question? Does this answer the question? Like, why should I have confidence in this or not? Cultivate an attitude of skepticism. Like assume that everything is like super biased and then look for evidence it's not. But start from the assumption that it's not trustworthy. That's a good exercise to try.
I have a little bit question, I'm a follow-up on that. So we've all been in a situation before. You go to a company, I'm a consultant like you are. So you go in a company and they have done personas, and an example, like 5 years ago. And then somebody else came in and redid the personas and new personas. And as you said, there is no confidence. We don't know who did them. We don't know why it was done. And we have too many of them. Like we have literally 85 personas, true story. That's kind of the same question, right? So it's kind of when you get to a place, kind of like there is this inherited research that no one really knows how it happened, who did it. We have no confidence. And how do you go in and either decide, you know what, let's just throw everything away and start from scratch? Or how do you decide collectively what do we need to keep and throw away?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And I always recommend, like when I actually go in-house, I go in, I work with people. I'm like, this is awesome. Like that's where you start. You're like, cool, you have so much stuff. That's awesome. I guess it's kind of like the Nailed It of research, if you've ever seen that show. And then you say, okay, what do we need to know? And that's the conversation you have. You have the like, what do we think we know? What do we need to know? Same conversation. And maybe in the course of that conversation, they say, oh, you know what? We learned this, and here's our evidence for that. And you go, cool. Maybe we feel like, oh, we do kind of know that. But you might say like, okay, well, we knew that 5 years ago. Do we know this today? Maybe we need to re-ask the question today. So it's that same conversation of what do we need to know? And always start with the now with the future. It's the same thing. Like if I'm doing like content design stuff, it's like, okay, what do we need to communicate? You start forward looking and then you say, okay, do we have anything that answers that? Because otherwise you're going to try to save and justify. So if you go in with the assumption that none of it's useful and you say, okay, but what do we need to know? Let's pretend that doesn't exist. And you start by forming the questions. And then you say, okay, does any of this that we created answer those questions? Maybe it does. But you have to start with what you need to know, not what stuff do we already have and like you're sorting through it like it's Antiques Roadshow. Like, is this horsey worth anything? Like that's how people treat their research reports.
I'm dying at your analogies and I can't wait to take all of them back to work with me later this afternoon. So something you mentioned earlier in our conversation was about getting great writers, and that would solve a lot of problems that we're trying to solve here. And Seema had a question of if you know any of examples of great organizations that are great because of their writing, along with the designers and developers. So, you know, people are just looking for that example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Apple. Going back to Apple, why is Apple so awesome? Look at how they use language. Look at how they value language. They're a big one. Look at their messaging. It's few words, right? Look for the people who use very few words very well. Because there's this idea of like more is more. But when it comes to like clear expression, people who are really concise and succinct and communicate super well. Let's see, who else is really, I'm trying to think who else is really easy to deal with and like good at it. I'm always terrible at coming up with examples of things like that on the fly. So I'm gonna look at my phone and be like, who doesn't suck? like MailChimp's pretty good. They've really cared about it. I think in banking, like Capital One's pretty good. Yeah, anybody who uses language really clearly and doesn't seem to have a lot of it is pretty good.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, if you look at interfaces, they're mostly words, right? And the graphic design is to put the words in the right place so you see them. But everybody starts by drawing boxes. The words are the important part. That's the meaning, That's a different book, though.
Yep, absolutely. There is a question from Michelle from earlier of if you are prevented from talking directly to users and customers, what kind of secondary research do you suggest, or do you even suggest doing that, or push forward with the primary users?
Yeah, I would also, two things. One, why are you prevented from talking to customers? Like, that's ridiculous. I know a lot of times there are constraints because of it. Yeah, I've worked with a lot of financial organizations. You can always talk to people who are like your customers. And this is why the recruiting is so important. Like if you're doing user, customer, audience research kind of things, you need to be really careful in who you talk to and getting a good, really well-developed, like people, there are so many platforms now that promise to just kind of deliver you research participants. I would say, no, don't use those. They're terrible. Because like the quality of your insights totally depends on whether you had participants who were truly representative of the right people. So in a situation where for whatever reason, whether it's like regulatory or whatever, you can't talk to actual existing customers or users, you can talk to people who represent those people. You can talk to people who are proxies. If you design your study right, you can always find those people. And again, the like, oh, you're not allowed to talk to people is usually code for I would prefer not to learn things about how people are in the world. But you can often, you can find things, but it all goes back to what do you need to know? And you can look at analogous research too, because people tend to get really specific about their research questions way too fast. It's like, do you want to know how people use certain devices in their day? Do you want to know like what's easy or hard? We know so much about what people want and need already. Like the knowledge is really out there, but people are just finding ways to justify doing things that aren't good because they sound fun to make.
So Erica, I want to be respectful of your time. Everybody's time over here. We're kind of like stretching a bit the time. Everyone here has been reading your book. What is Erica reading right now?
Oh God, what am I reading? Let's see.
Those 35 books?
Yeah, I'm reading these 35 books. One that I really like, because I've been reading a lot about architecture, because I think a lot of things, the field of like digital interactive design is really relatively new, and we're struggling with a lot of things around practices and around ethics that I think people like. Architecture is not perfect by any means, but I think there's better developed thinking and better developed scholarship. This is a book I like. It's a little too neoliberal. It's called Order Without Design: How Markets Shape Cities. And I think this is a really good one for service designers or UX designers to read, because it's about how we're participating in systems, and the systems that create the built environment are like really inflexible relative to the other things we're doing. But there's still an idea that an individual designer, like so much of our practice is based on this idea that like, oh, I'm dictating or controlling things, as opposed to, oh, I'm trying to like like move the way like forces go in the world. I'm trying to influence really complex systems. Like that's the reframing of design I like to see. And a lot of it has to do with value and economics, and designers don't like to think about business. I'm reading that. God, what else am I actually like reading? That's super good. Oh, David Graeber, who unfortunately, he's fantastic. And he sadly passed away last year. The Utopia of Rules on Technology, Stupidity, and the Secret Joys of Bureaucracy. His stuff's really good. And like, I'm so sad that I only really got into his work after he passed away, because I feel like his perspective on the world is so, and the way he thinks about value and incentives and so much of the social fiction that we take as reality shapes how we operate in the world.
Very cool. So yeah, Erica, we have probably like 30 awesome questions from the audience. We will not be able to address those. So Lauren, how do you want to handle this?
Yeah, well, first of all, Erica, thank you so much for spilling your wisdom onto all of this. There have been so many amazing positive feedback in the Slack channel, and I think we have a "What would Erica do" thread going. So thank you so much. Yes, as Greg mentioned, there are a bunch of questions uncovered, but I think we do have a UX research and strategy Slack. And so I know Jen has posted the link to sign up for our Slack channel a bunch of times, but if everybody wants to join our Slack, we can continue the conversation there and post some of the questions to have a conversation between the group. And there are awesome researchers here that can help answer those questions or just have that conversation. Erica, you're obviously welcome to join our Slack channel as well. But I think this has just been so awesome, inspirational, and thank you very much. And please, everybody, fill out the follow-up survey that we've got. I know Jen's going to post a link to that too. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the session and your ideas for next session. Greg or Erica, anything else to close us out before we all get back?
I mean, thank you so much, Erica. It feels like we just, scratched the surface. We can do this every week. It feels like we'll do it again. We may do another one in a couple of months, maybe. But thank you so much for your help. Thank you so much for being so blunt and candid. As you mentioned, research can be very academic and very difficult to access and to approach. So I'm really appreciating the fact you are just cutting through the cloth and telling us how it is. So that was really refreshing. I appreciate it a lot.
Oh, super. Yeah. So many, I just want people to spend their time, doing things that are more effective and not spend their time doing things that aren't. And I know that, and there are plenty of other people out there who have the academic side covered. So that's sort of my role. And I'm on Twitter too much. So if you have other questions, you can find me there. I'm Mule Girl. Feel free, or email me. That's cool. So yeah, no, this was super fun. I love answering these questions because the problems are the same all over the world, and all it is like it's hard work to chip away at this, because so much of these objections and fear of learning, I guess the closing thought is people are really afraid. And that's where so much of this comes from, is people want certainty, and the idea that you're never done learning and that you can't just be done. That's what drives so much of this is this fear. And a lot of the objections and the roadblocks that you encounter are really people trying to protect themselves. And once you realize that, then you can stop trying to prove people wrong, which will never be effective. And you can always think, oh, how do I help create an environment where everybody feels supported by each other to be on this, in this uncomfortable journey together, because it's always going to be uncomfortable. But it can be fun and exciting and rewarding, but you've got to recognize that the objections come from fear.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And as well, thank you to everybody who's been joining us today. We have over 1,000 people from Australia to Russia to Portugal to Canada. Thank you so much for joining us. The recording will be available most likely tonight or tomorrow on both channels. And we really appreciate having you. It was good to see everybody, and we hope to see you again next time. Lauren?
Yes, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your morning, evening, afternoon, whatever it is, wherever you are. And thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Erica.
Thank you.
Bye, all.
Good to see all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.